So, where are we as a church, especially across North America, Canada, and the United States? Are we doing the things God really wants us to do? Are we representing Him well? Our next guest has a few thoughts on this. Rick Lawrence is the executive director of Vibrant Faith. He also pastors a home church for young people, and he's authored over 40 books. His latest is entitled Editing Jesus, Confronting the Distorted Faith of the American Church. And he joins us now from Denver, Colorado. Rick, welcome to Bridge City News.
Good morning, Hal. Thank you.
Now, most books have an origin story behind them. What is the origin of Editing Jesus?
That's a great question. So, about 3 years ago, I was invited by Jake Bland, who's the youngest president in Youth for Christ history. I think he was named president when he was 32. And I had a previous, 5 years ago, relationship with Jake. A friend of a friend asked me to mentor him. And so I used to meet with him once a month. And then 5 years later, he's the youngest president of Youth for Christ. I'd like to take credit for that, but he was already brilliant. And he asked me to be on an hour-long Q&A with Youth for Christ leaders across the country. And it was a live Q&A with about 400 of his leaders online. And at the very end, he asked me a question I wasn't expecting. He said, Rick, what do you think is the greatest challenge facing the American church today? And I took a beat for a moment, and then I said, editing Jesus. And he said, what do you mean by that? So I spent 10 minutes describing what I meant by that. And after that call was over, about 5 minutes later, he emailed me and said, okay, my text and email is blowing up because all of these leaders want to know more about what you're talking about. And that started the seed. Like, okay, Jesus, is this something you want me to pursue? And now 3 years later, I have a book.
So, how would you summarize it actually editing Jesus in society today?
Yeah, so the premise of the book is that the much covered decline of the church, which in the book I call it a pruning, not a decline. A decline sounds like we have a problem with our business plan. Actually, God's hands are on the shears of the church all the time. He's always pruning the church, and we're going through a difficult and painful season of pruning right now. Well, why is he pruning the church? That's what the exploration of this book is about. We have shifted our attention, focus, and understanding of Jesus us off. So whenever there's a trajectory that's off, if it starts off small this way, the longer you go, the wider the gap. And the gap between who Jesus really is and who he's being described as in churches, or how we live the Christian life based on following Jesus, the gap is getting wider and wider. And it's showing up in a lot of ways. In this book, I pursue 8 different ways I believe the church has edited Jesus in a significant way, the impact that has, and then contrast that with the way of Jesus that adheres to who he is in his unedited, the unedited Jesus. What does it look like to follow him and live in his ways?
Now, many people believe that the North American church has been in decline over the last couple of decades, Rick, particularly among young people today. Why do you think that is?
Well, in the book, I can actually read this to you in the introduction because I lead a group of about a couple of dozen young people in our home for the last 10 years. It's an unusual thing that we do. It's not a normal small group. I call it a home church, but our motto is pursuing the heart of Jesus, not his recipes, which means that we're only interested in pursuing the beauty, wonder, and disruptive presence of Jesus in 1,000 different ways. We are not focused on life application, and there's a reason for that. Jesus said that the way to transformation is a branch abiding in the vine. To abide in him who is the vine, it's not a should, it's an invitation. So how are we coming to know the true heart of Jesus? When that happens, you're magnetically drawn to him or you're repelled by him. But I asked the young people in our group why they were so disaffected with church, because that comes up often in our group. And in the introduction to the book, I list some of the things that just they blurted out about why they're not enamored of today's church. And let me just read you a couple of things from what I put in the book. Um, what they're saying is the church doesn't reflect the heart of Jesus. It's rules based, not relationally based. There's a big disconnect between what the church values and what Jesus values. Skipping down in this list of things that they said, they at the end they said the world is watching the church more than the church thinks it is, and it's teaching things that aren't about Jesus. They're more like TED Talks. We don't want self-help. We want Jesus. I think what they're saying is prophetic, because in the book I talk about what is most often the framework that people hear in a sermon or in the discipleship formation at church, and it's some version of try harder to be better, or another way of saying it is understand the biblical principle and apply it to your life. It's we wouldn't like to think of it this way, but these young people are right. I think it is a version of self-help that isn't the way Jesus transformed people or engaged them.
So, Rick, let's talk about engaging. How can we get more young people engaged? Some of the churches I've attended to in the past, there's the worship for a little bit, maybe 15, 20 minutes, then a 30 to 45-minute message, and then a little bit of worship at the end. Some of the young people I've chatted with say they're bored and they feel disengaged. How can we get them more excited about worshiping Jesus and attending church once again?
Right. Well, if you think about what you just said, the way to translate that from a young person's point of view is disrespect. The church doesn't respect me enough to engage me, in a significant way. So in the group that I lead, and I train other ministry leaders on how to lead in the way that I lead this group, it's highly interactive and conversational. It's experiential, and we use a methodology I call co-discovery. It's where everyone in the room is discovering together, um, what uh, what we're learning about Jesus. Everyone in the room has an equal voice in the room. I guide and lead through a experiential interactive template of where we're going to go, but I just led one of these last night. I don't know what they're going to say. I don't know what they're going to uncover as we discover together in pairs, trios, foursomes, the whole group. So it's a highly engaging night. It sounds like a jet engine in our house. It's 2 hours long, and sometimes it feels short because of that. And what happens, and we talked about this last night, that young people feel intrinsically respected because their voice matters, and they see me learning from them in this context, not just them learning from me. They see themselves and hear each other uncovering things about Jesus that they had never discovered before. So this way of leading young people is possible. It means a shift in the way that leaders think about what they're doing. Instead of delivering a sermon, they are guiding people through a highly interactive, um, co-discovery environment where my voice really matters still, but my voice isn't the only voice that matters.
Rick, in your book, you mentioned the term reverse engineers involving our walk with Christ. What do you mean by that?
So reverse engineering means that we start with Jesus and we work ourselves back instead of the other way around. So right now we tacitly start with our own life, our own priorities, our own value system, our own comfort level, and then we work our way toward Jesus and what fits as we work toward him. Instead, reverse engineering means we start with Jesus and we say, Jesus not only is good, but he's the source of all goodness. Everything he says and does is good. So I'm going to work my way back from there and see how everything he says and does intersects with my life and challenges it. For instance, there's a chapter in the book on the supernatural. Why is there a chapter in the book on editing Jesus about how we've edited away the supernatural from Jesus and from the Christian life? The reason it's in there, and it's an uncomfortable chapter for a lot of people to read, the reason it's in there is because Jesus acted supernaturally all the time, and he told his disciples they would be too. He famously said, the things that I'm doing, you're going to do as well, even greater things. And that statement is what I call a mud puddle. When an adult comes up to a mud puddle, we jump over it. When a kid comes up to a mud puddle, they jump into it. And Jesus has invited us to be like kids. So when Jesus says, "You're going to do greater things than me," adults go, "Well, there's Jesus for you. I'm just going to jump over that one because what does that mean?" A kid will wallow in that and say, "Well, what did he mean?" Like if I took that seriously, what would that mean for my life? In what way might I open myself in a way that I haven't before? What implications does that have in my life if I took that seriously instead of editing it away right at the start? So we have all kinds of ways that we edit things right at the start because we think, I'm not going to do that. I don't even understand that. So that's off the table. So reverse engineering means we start with everything Jesus said and did and said, that's valuable no matter what it is, and it matters to my life. So what does that mean?
I think for many of us, it can be a real challenge to reconcile the love and kindness of Jesus with the hard edges that he taught and lived. So, how do we sort that out?
Yeah, so we have an interesting relationship with hard, don't we? We know from our own personal experience when we've gone through a hard season in life or when we are doing some physical activity that's hard, that it bears good fruit. We can look back on it and say, "Oh, I wouldn't want to go through that again," but boy, I wouldn't. I don't want to miss the fruit that that created in me. So we have this kind of tension around what is hard. At the very beginning, I said that God is pruning the church right now. Well, if you are the plant being pruned, it is very painful to be pruned. To have your leaves clipped, you should go on YouTube and look up grafting fruit trees sometime to see what a master gardener does to actually graft a branch into a vine. If we are the branch, just imagine yourself that this is happening to you when the leaves are clipped, it looks like all that makes you beautiful and full of life is being cut off. Well, why would a gardener do that? So these hard things that we experience in life often feel like that. They're very painful. But Jesus is interested in transformation. He's not interested in the American dream, for instance, which is a template, a blueprint for a comfortable life. Jesus is interested in our transformation, and it is a major job because he can't unilaterally do this in us. It all comes by invitation, so he has to woo us into our transformation, and he does, and he does that in the midst of the hard things that we experience.
So, Rick, in our transformation, should we become justice warriors on behalf of the church? Is it our responsibility to fight the injustices in the world?
Uh, Well, it's an interesting word, responsibility. So, if you love someone, like here's an example I use a lot with my wife. My wife loves warm water. She does not drink cold water ever, not even in the summer. So when I'm putting dinner on the table and filling water glasses, if I forget to put her glass of water in the microwave for 1 minute and just put it on the table, I'm not just um, ignoring what she's asked me to do. I'm also ignoring her heart and my love for her. I know that she loves warm water. If I don't serve her that, I'm forgetting her in that moment. That's how she receives it. And so our our responsibility is really more the fruit of our intimate love relationship with him. There are many things that we do that look like obedience, and they are obedience, but they're really the fruit of a generative relationship with him, which becomes like breathing for us eventually. We don't even think about some of the obedient decisions we're making because they're just expressions of how much we love him, just in the same way I express those things in my marriage.
Now, Rick, can you give us an overview of the 8 ways the Western Church is really editing Jesus and why you chose them?
Yeah, so here, good overview. So the first chapter is called "The Commingling of Kingdoms." It's really the kind of the low hanging fruit in the book. It's the most obvious way in which we've edited Jesus today. Our approach to power in the Christian world in America is very different than the approach Jesus takes to power. How he engages power and how he expresses power is very different than how we express it. Um, and in every case, Jesus resisted and deconstructed and undermined approaches to power that were intended to build political strength or insurrectionist momentum towards something, he cut it off. So it's an exploration of, well, if we're following Jesus, it means that we're also adopting his patterns for how to engage and express power. So what does that look like? There's another chapter I've already mentioned called The Problem with Principles, which really goes after our primary way that we have adopted for trying to help people find transformation, which is understand the principle and then apply it to your life. And so I deconstruct that and spotlight how Jesus said we're transformed. There's a chapter on materialism and how it's threaded its way into our gospel. There's a chapter on how we've marginalized the poor. We've adopted sort of an Old Testament, tacitly adopted an Old Testament view of the poor, which means that if you're poor for a reason. God, you're out of favor with God. You have responsibility for your poverty ultimately. And that is an Old Testament view of the poor that Jesus came to shatter. And yet, in the church, in the American church today, we have the tacit examples of that very attitude. There's another chapter on platforming, meaning that we live in a culture that says, in order for you to be significant and influential, you have to build your platform, whether that's you're an average person on social media, or whether you're an author like me, or an artist, or a newscaster, that you have to build your following in order to have influence and power. And that is diametrically opposed to the way of Jesus. So there's a chapter on that. There's a chapter like what you just mentioned on justice and how justice is at the center of God's heart. So if we love God and are expressing his life in our life, we will certainly be involved in advocating for justice. Not because we're supposed to, but because we have the heart of Jesus in us. And justice is central to the movement and mission of God throughout the Old and New Testaments.
Rick Lawrence is the author of Editing Jesus, Confronting the Distorted Faith of the American Church. Rick, thanks so much for joining us today from Denver, Colorado.
Thank you so much, Hal.